thanks everyone for joining us today. We are talking about security training. So it is an offering that we have, and we're not going to make this a heavy sales pitch. We want to introduce it to you, and those who are used to our webinars know there's no way we're not going to share quite a bit of information about what's going on from a security front. So thanks for joining us today. We'll spend about a half hour, and as Brian said, there's opportunities to share and connect both during today's webinar and separate from it. So welcome everybody from across the globe, particularly from North America. But let's get started. And some of you who have seen us talk about fraud before know we talk about threats and defense and issues. Just a couple things to highlight here. Why is it so serious? You know fraud is serious. You're on a webinar about fraud. Not just for fun. So what's going on? I'm just going to highlight a couple items here. The average cyber insurance claim is $8 million now. That's what it takes to resolve issues from small to large. That's what the claim results in. On the left-hand side, many of you will have seen this before. Check fraud is this darker box on the bottom. Those payments tend to be, or losses tend to be in the $1,000 to $2,000 range. And oftentimes around $1,600 for a loss. Check fraud is still there. It's still real. You move up about 100x of that, and you get wire BEC fraud. And those numbers do jump around from year to year. This was a compilation from FBI activity, about 130,000. And so those numbers continue to update. Some of those losses are quite a bit more. On the system level fraud side, you can think of different situations where there's been takeovers, a number of banks using some of the platforms that connect to Swift messaging, for example, like the Central Bank of Bangladesh, where $101 million was wired out because of the control of the system. The net loss was $81 million. But the ability to convince you to send money out through some type of business email compromise fraud, or by actually controlling systems, these are significant payouts. They're much, much higher. Then the next point, really briefly, if we look at ransomware was typically about $10,000 a loss. That quickly grew to $110,000 on average. Well, that loss per payout has increased. Why has it increased? They're getting in deeper into organizations. They're combining it with an exfiltration of data. And so they're really maximizing their yield of ransomware. So those are significant items. Now, this goes on to, we want to move on to the concept of how do we protect our organizations? Well, there's, the processes we use, the system defenses, and the human element. So the human element is how do people help provide a defense against this? And where are organizations weakest? We believe that organizations have become weakest in the human element side, the trained people side, particularly for payment fraud. We're all doing quite well about not inserting thumb drives into our computers, don't click on phishing emails, but there's still a significant number of areas that threaten the payment system and payment process in our organizations. That brings us to our first poll question. What's your experience with fraud? So this will pop up in aggregate, of course, last 12 months. So think back a year to last summer. Which ones have you experienced attacks on or a successful fraud? You don't have to distinguish whether it's been successful or fraud, but look at all that apply. And if you know that those have occurred as an attempt or as a reality, please go ahead and click on that. Wow, interesting. So check fraud forgery still number one there, 81% saw it, 69% business email compromise. It's interesting. I've got to believe that number's higher. It's just we're not always aware of it because it happens in so many areas and we don't always see it. Nobody reports, oh yeah, I got a bunch of junk last time that was attempting to be a business email compromise. And so those numbers might in fact be higher, but still, look, card fraud, ACH, ransomware, massive coverage and exposures across the board. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I see some comments too about experiences with on a daily basis with clients. But let's continue our journey and discussion on this. So our corporate experience with fraud, this is from a survey, from the Treasury Fraud and Control Survey. Suspected fraud and actual fraud, they experienced this over the past year. That's 4 out of 5 had those type of attempts and experience. So your experience may be different. Your ability to know what happened throughout your organization also differs. But what do we know generally? What's been happening over time? Well, this is escalating. It's a significant level of fraud. It's been escalating significantly over multiple years. So this is also a compounding impact as well. We look at what's significantly increased over the prior year for fraud, the threat level. Back in 1919, 16% over the prior year. And despite the fact that 16% felt that it increased, the next year 20% over the prior year, and then 25% over the prior year, and then 29% over the prior year. And I'm not saying this to get everyone scared or excited, but to say that there's a greater recognition that this is happening. And why this recognition seems to be growing as well is it's moving downstream to mid-size, commercial-sized clients, as well as small businesses. They're getting wrapped up as well because the attacks are highly automated. So it's significantly increasing threat level, continues to increase year over year on a compounding basis. So what's the layered security? We talked about systems. So we might think about perimeter systems, what's your IT group, your CISO, your Chief Information Security Officer, CISO, may be working on. There might be permissions inside the organization restricting who can see certain data, so that the principle of least privileges, you can only see the data or access the information that you need to see. So that's another element of layered security. And then having the processes provide the right type of control. And so everybody who's on from a Treasury perspective probably understands that the way you set up your banking structure can greatly aid your ability to defend your organization's cash. Having dedicated accounts to receive funds, to send out funds, and then having concentration accounts, which only receive and send money to those other accounts, allows certain types of nefarious and fraudulent activity to be spotted right away. It also allows you to put on those bank services that your banks tell you should do that are commercially reasonable and help in that process. And finally, this is one of the most overlooked areas for security. Overlooked not in terms of nobody's looking at it whatsoever, but the training tends to be focused on protecting your emails, desktop hygiene. It's not really focused on payment process security. So this is an area where these new attacks, new methods are coming on board. And there's a lot of people involved in payments in organizations, from Treasury to AP to executives. And the fraud prevention training is meant to combine all these items and really have a key and core focus on payment security across all of these domains. So even if you're not responsible for IT security, you're touching on those other areas and understand what those risks are. So this slide shows what's your experience with types of fraud. I think we were at 69% on our poll question, 73% from our survey showed that. As we move across, you can see payment diversion, cyber fraud, significant minority to a significant majority of firms have suffered, some type of loss or some type of fraud, or attempts across these different attack vectors. So the threat is real. You know that. You're on a webinar for that topic. But this is how it's broken out by some of the types. And none of these are shrinking. Our next poll question is select one. Where's the largest opportunity for improving security principles in your organization? So think about this for a moment. What is the top area? When you see it, you might say we can work on every area, but what do you see as the top area? Go ahead and enter that and select submit. So awareness, understanding, and testing, readiness and response, controls, dual controls, encryption and control keys, speed, the speed of detection, the principle of least privilege, like isolating who can see or do what. All right, here come the results. So the largest opportunities is awareness. Oh, well, far and away is awareness, understanding, and testing. That seems to be common in most companies we talk with, that there's so many changes that are going on. A lot of these attack methods are meant to compromise people and their understanding, and they're really, really quite good at it. There's a great article on CTM File, which is a media outlet we own, about some deep fakes and what's going on there. I encourage you to go to that. Brian will pop that into the chat box for that article, or at least the site. The lowest, principle of least privilege, that seems to be pretty well controlled here. That's awesome. Usually we find that when that's looked at, there's a lot more, let's say, permissive privileges in an organization than we see. So thank you so much for answering those from the, I guess, from top to bottom. But let's continue. What what can we think about in terms of security practices? These are your bankers, and your bankers are smart. So are people in corporations. But how are bankers smart? They're talking to a lot of customers and see and aggregate a lot of experiences together, because they're talking to 20 or 40 customers directly, and they talk to other bankers. And so they have very good understanding of the market. What are they saying? What top security practices do they wish their clients used, but many are not using currently? Regular internal training and testing. That one we put a box around. That ties into our prior item. The first one, leveraging payment controls such as positive pay, ACH, debit blocks, etc. Now I'm just going to talk about that for a moment. Your banks suggest that you use these. There's a reason they ask you to use these services. They're commercially reasonable. They're not making a fortune on those. They're making these recommendations to prevent you from having a loss. Every loss is a loss of money, but also of time, of concern, and nobody benefits other than the criminals from the loss. So when you look at this one here, this chart here, 2/3 or more identify those top three: payment controls, internal training and testing, and a multi-factor authentication where possible. Really good advice from a group that cares about your needs from their experience. What's going on with Treasury security training and testing? What's the difference between corporates and banks? So if you look at banks, 78% have security training with testing and quizzes. That's very, very much more common on the bank side than on the corporate side. But those continue to move up every year. There's much more training. Pretty much 100% of banks do training, and the numbers have climbed on the corporate side. The testing component is also growing. But when we look at these different elements about technology, about the human component, both of those are essential. It's not technology will solve everything, because if you don't have people trained, they will break down the controls by convincing people to use their functionality to do so. If you look at the human security components, if you don't have your firewall set up, if you don't have privileges and permissions, tokenization, your whole network is open, you'll have a problem. So both of these are essential. And so here are some components. So we think about these components on the human side and on the technology side in terms of understanding those, applying those, and that is also enforced throughout the training. So the different courses that you may take align to what your role is. You may want understanding what goes on from an awareness perspective, or you may need to know how to implement some of this activity in a deeper way, depending on what your particular responsibilities and directives are. But what should Treasury look like? When we think about payment security, how do we understand this viewpoint about there's a payment process? There's a someone's requesting a payment. There's some source for that, but there's components to it. There's the overall process and the system that you use. There's the architecture for your network that has access from the outside. There's the activities that people do to move things through the process, to monitor the activity, and to track what goes on. So, what should it look like? When you think about a security framework, there's a lot of components that need to be protected. We start in the upper right. We think about bank information. How do you protect that? How do you protect bank information? Well, you're not sending it via email. Is it encrypted locally? Are you encrypting it if you're using the bank's website? That should be part of the process to make sure the data is either encrypted or it's tokenized. Tokenized simply means you replace the secure data or the sensitive data with a token. So if someone steals the data, they've stolen a token that has a reference to the data that they don't have. So it's essentially useless data. So you want to protect it, make it so they can't access it. If they access it, it's encrypted or it's tokenized or hidden. As we move around, here's another area that tends not to be a focus too much: files in transit. It's when I say not too much of focus, it's something that most organizations are looking at. When I send payment files to the bank, I'm always doing that securely. I use encryption. I share keys to lock it down, and the transmission to the bank tends to be quite good. Whether I send it with FTP, I use a streaming methodology or API where everything's all connected, or even if I load it in a portal. Once it gets into the portal, it's good. But what we mean here, where it's not so well done, is that files that move around your organization, there's usually opportunities where those files are available to be intercepted or edited. It might have control totals that won't allow you to change detail records without it being detected. But files can be exposed in different ways. So examples might be a file is put out on a directory, someone pulls it to their desktop, and then loads it through a bank portal. That file is very much subject to some type of compromise. So when you think about what's going on for payment security, where are the points of exposure, we have to look across all of these different areas. And where will the criminals come in? Wherever it's easiest. Is it files in transit, through a person, and across the board? So this is something to make sure when you do a payment security audit, a payment process inventory to see where payments are being made, from where to where, how is the data being protected, how is it being controlled, and what kind of validation steps are in place. So a couple items there to get you thinking. As we continue on, what is SecureTreasury? And that's a picture of me on the right with a bad haircut, but I think that's the best they can do with the camera. And then there's this criminal with the whatever kind of mask. I guess the mask probably should have some holes in it if the criminal is going to see what goes on. But it's run through a learning management system on the web, and it's a training course where you can go through tutorials where it's video, it's moving text, motion graphics, animation, lecture. So it allows you to go through and listen to the material, take the test. It has handouts, so you can fill in the answers or review the material or see what the structure is flowing. So whether you're more audible, visual, or written, there's transcripts of the material. You can watch it. You take the test. As soon as you're done, you can submit the test. You get the immediate response. If you failed, you can go back and take the test. The question cycle, you can listen in or focus in on different areas, and that information is all summarized. So if you're a manager wanting to make sure, hey, we need to protect the payment processes, all of this reporting can be done by area to the managers. So maybe AP has certain courses they need to take, Treasury others, executive management other courses, and so it could be managed. We do updates on this every quarter. We send out newsletters that talk about security issues, threats, penetration that's occurred in organizations, defensive methods, and we're also updating courses. We're putting new courses out every quarter in addition to the newsletters. So this is used by corporations, nonprofits. Some of the largest banks, or one of the largest banks in the US, has started using that for training their clients to make sure they're trained and kept up to speed. So great way to stay current on payment processes, attack vectors, etc. So course recommendations, here's a simple layout. Many of you might be familiar with learning management systems where you can set courses, into pathways, or into a series that makes sense. So here's some examples of the groupings that we have. So if you have card security, PCI DSS, there's training there for executive management, for accounting, for IT that's complies with the payment card industry data security standards. There's advanced security. There's training for AR, foundational security across a number of areas, and more. This is just one way of showing what some options where the courses can be structured for your organization and the different roles that exist. So you've got to do these 4, someone's got to do these 10. They're all layered out there. That brings us to our next poll question. Our next and final, I am interested. This is, I'd like to get a short demo of SecureTreasury. I'd like to receive more information about SecureTreasury. And I just want to stay current with webinars and articles. I'm not really interested in the course or learning more about it at this time. So I'd like a short demo. I'd like to receive more information about it before I decide if a demo makes sense or just webinars and articles. So I'll let you answer those. We'll leave that up. I'm going to move to the next slide because I want to mention another resource. So we have a book, Payment Security and Fraud Prevention. This is the principles of secure clamps. And in the chat box, you can see the download. There's a bit.ly short clip. You can drop it into your browser and download this ebook. This is a book that outlines 12 security principles that begin with the letters that make up the name Secure Clamps. So that's something that would be great for you to download and read further. That's one resource that makes a lot of sense to spend some time on. You can think about those principles. Some of them you'll be like, I'm really familiar with this. Others might be, this is a new concept, or I can see how this would apply differently. And then you can factor that into your own process and your own stewardship protection of your payment processes. So some good stuff there to look at. It's download. I think you just have to enter some of your contact information. Maybe your browser has it pre-filled, but you'll get that book and download it. Encourage you to do that. Feel free to send the link out to others so they can download their own copy too, and that's free. For those that are showing at the AFP, we invite you to stop by our booth. We will have that as a physical book that'll be in a very unique package, let's just say. So I invite you to come and get that. It'll look very different from any other book you may have picked up, at least as an adult. So there you go. We're going to go ahead and keep moving on to this contact page. And first, I want to thank you for listening to this brief presentation on security and SecureTreasury. Thank you for your attention. Brian has a couple really key elements to bring up and then some additional resources that he will share as well. So Brian, I want to invite you back to the webinar.
Thank you, Craig, and indeed, thank you everyone for joining us today. If you'd like more information or have any questions, Brooks, whose information is on the slide, will be happy to talk with you. And be sure to download, like Craig said, the free Secure Clamps ebook by clicking the link in the chat box. Thank you, and we hope you have a good rest of the day.